I think it's a very interesting decade ahead. Having spent 3 decades in different parts of the world and now migrating to Europe, I find that for the coming decade, there are 3 fundamental challenges for European museums. First and foremost, Europe is not Europe anymore. We have to think of the end of Europe, that with globalization, with the transformation of the world economy, and the crisis right now in Europe from being a little bit more inward-looking is to look outwards and engage internationally through intercultural dialogue in such a way that that dialogue is not just about culture, but culture as the 4th pillar of sustainable development with social, economic, and environmental sustainability. Number 2, the second priority in my opinion is that faith is something that museums in Europe as well as the rest of the world have never really addressed with comfort. When we deal with something to do with Christianity, we're comfortable because it's very much within the European tradition of representation, interpretation, and European hegemonic aesthetic discourse. But Europe is changing as rapidly as the rest of the world. In fact, Europe is in a privileged position. For instance, you take Australia, Canada, United States, New Zealand, some of these countries which were colonized by outside agencies, and indigenous people have been reduced to minorities. These countries, these parts of the world have largely been immigrant or invaded, if you like, or settler places. For them, addressing cultural diversities in terms of recent centuries, if not recent decades of immigration, whereas Europe is very different in the sense the host populations are the majority, but Europe has engaged with the rest of the world for a long time, and now it continues to engage with the rest of the world through its own culturally and linguistically diverse population. For instance, if Europe is trying to engage with India, there's people of Indian descent in Europe who become your mediators, your cultural mediators, whether you're thinking of economic opportunities, whether you're thinking of environmental responsibilities, whether you're dealing with climate change. So as a result of this change, you also have people following different religions, different faiths in Europe, far more than so in the past. The kind of crusade mentality of thinking crusades are with the people outside has to go. It has to be based on reconciliation, cross-cultural understanding, and based on interfaith dialogue. That we really have to think in terms of that all cultures and all faiths in Europe are equally valid, and we need to promote an understanding, an intercultural understanding, so that we learn to practice the Charter of Human Rights and the cultural equality that EU advocates through its charters and recommendations. The third challenge is something even more fundamental. What is Europe? What is a nation state in Europe? Are we going back to 1815? Are we moving forward into 2015? If we're moving forward, the borders, the physical borders are becoming less and less important. There are so many liminal spaces as countries amalgamate, merge into European Union, irrespective of those cynics who question the validity of European Union. It is the future. It is a reality. It's always good to have dissent, but then that's okay for debate. But let's focus on the fact that Europe is moving forward as one of the most exciting, culturally and linguistically diverse places in the world. In this context, when we talk about our sense of place and identity, intangible heritage has been neglected in the past, especially since World War II, where there was so much devastation in Europe. The focus has largely been on reconstruction, redevelopment of tangible heritage. Even the Hague Convention of 1954 and the World Heritage Convention of 1972 are now transformed, where they're addressing more than the tangible. And Europe too is addressing more than the tangible heritage. So it's dealing with intangible heritage. But what's really important is to take an integrated approach rather than create another watertight compartment that this is intangible heritage. There's a dialectic between the two, between the intangible and the tangible. How does one deal with the dialectic? How does one take an integrated approach? In doing so, with a European Union that's increasingly, by the day, more and more wired and connected, wireless, if you like, and taken over by social media, what is the role of intergenerational transmission? By that I mean, there was a time when we talked about intergenerational transmission as from existing carriers, custodians, and transmitters of knowledge to the next generation. But the next generation these days is very social media savvy, very internet savvy, very nerdy if you like, unlike some of the people of my generation. So what does intergenerational transmission mean? So we have to rethink some of the conventional ways of understanding what is heritage, tangible and intangible, and new and creative and innovative ways. So it's here the future of Europe is dependent upon not just thinking in terms of as a mindset of the past, but as an open-ended book. And if you like, I'd like to once again quote Umberto Eco's, the open book. There's a whole range of experiences that constitute what is Europe. When I say experiences, I don't mean cultural experiences alone. I mean social, environmental, economic experiences. But those experiences should inform the way we read, understand, and experience Europe as we move forward into the next decade. Can museums change the world? I think it's a very interesting question. I would like to answer this in two different ways. First and foremost, there is the argument that we can't be all things to all people. And having said that, museums increasingly are not spaces for the elites alone. With the growth of participatory democracy, what you have is multiple stakeholders, multiple ownerships of museums. And even private museums are increasingly realizing that they have to engage with those stakeholders that conventionally were not part of their constituency. So in this context, the second aspect is we're in very interesting times. In the old days when we talked about people traveling, pilgrimages were our first forms of tourism. Like people went on a pilgrimage and it was like a touristic activity. They were visitors. They were on a spiritual journey. But now if you look at Europe, if you look at all the cheap flights, that you take to fly across from one place to another, and people are moving very rapidly for recreational experiences. And tourism is no longer tourism. All tourism is cultural tourism. There's only so much sun, sand, and surf that people can take. But people also want to experience something more than that, so that they can take away a memory more than a tanned skin or a burnt skin. And so in doing that, what they want to do is they want to experience the places where they're going to. Not so much authentic experiences, but experiences that help them to take a memory back as part of their recreational experience. And it's here that you have a choice. Either you can provide them a McDonald's phenomena of experience, so it's the same everywhere, or you can create an experience based on the sense of place and identity of the place. So for example, we'll give you an example of Ibiza. Ibiza struggles. It's a World Heritage Site, but it struggles because a lot of people used to go to Ibiza for the beautiful sands and sun and swimming. But the World Heritage Management there, which is very committed to people understanding the outstanding universal values of Ibiza, are desperately trying to make sure that people actually experience more than just the sea and the sun and sand. And this is where museums as sites to provide these experiences could play a very important role in the world's fastest growth industry, I think 13th or 14th year in a row, and that is cultural tourism. Secondly, as we talk about, in my second point, I have a sub-point, that is, as we talk about the transformations in in the populations of Europe, we think of education, we think of cross-cultural awareness, all these things. Museums are powerful agencies because they have objects. Objects are signifiers of values, signifiers of layers of importance. Objects can be opened up and read like an open-ended book in many ways. And one could create a whole range of learning contexts to promote interfaith dialogue and intercultural dialogue that we so desperately needed to build a more inclusive and interculturally sophisticated Europe. And lastly, every museum that is relevant to the local community, every museum that provides a good quality experience to a visitor from outside, not only provides the visitor more time to spend locally, but it actually contributes to the local economy, because the more experiences people have, the longer they stay. And in crass tourism terms, that means bed nights. Every extra night they stay is good for the local economy, the local GDP. And so in every sense of the word, and I can go on about this because I teach in this area, and I run workshops in this area for professionals in the heritage field, but there are multiple ways that museums can play a very important role as civic spaces, in social, economic, environmental, and economic engagement in the new and emerging profile of Europe that we are yet to scope and understand. So the future is exciting, and I'm really happy to move to Europe at this very exciting time. And yes, there are challenging times, but challenging times provide for creativity and innovation, as history has always demonstrated. During opulent times, there was little creativity, only decadence, as you know, from the Roman Empire. But challenging times are exciting times. Thank you.